Hi everybody, welcome back to Icelandic for Foreigners. In this video we're going to be talking about numbers, specifically the numbers 1 through 4. Now if you're wondering why we're stopping at 4, it's because the numbers 1 through 4 are the most complicated in Icelandic and the most difficult to use. So once I'm done with this video I'm going to make another video talking about all the other numbers, and I promise that one will be easier. But this one, it's going to be a lot of information. And I'm going to divide this video into two halves. The first half is going to go over the most important rules, the ones that you really need to know to be able to use numbers correctly. Well, that's true for the second half too, but the second half, it's maybe rules that are a little bit less important, especially as you're starting to speak, so I would call them slightly more advanced rules. But I'll let you know when that's going to be, and those who are just beginning can go ahead and stop the video and work on what they've already learned, and those who want more advanced rules can move on. So let's talk about the first rule for the numbers 1 through 4, and that is agreement. Specifically, the numbers 1 through 4 must agree with the noun that they're modifying in gender and case. Now, as you know, Icelandic has 3 genders, masculine, feminine, and neuter, and 4 cases, nominative, accusative, dative, and genitive. If you're unclear or fuzzy on what that means, I definitely encourage you to go check out my video about Icelandic cases. It's important that you at least have an idea of what that means before watching the rest of this video, otherwise it's not going to make too much sense. So let's look at some examples. Let's start by looking at the number 1 and all its different forms. In a lot of ways, these numbers act like adjectives, and they have different forms depending on the gender and the case. So here we have our chart, and if we look at the nominative, the different forms of 1 in nominative, we have a masculine, feminine, and neuter form. So the masculine form is eighth, the feminine form is ein, and the neuter form is eighth. Our accusative forms look like eighth, eina, and eighth. The dative forms are einum, eitni, and einu, and the genitive forms are eins, eitnar, and eins. Now, I made a video not too long ago about what's called the hin chart, which is kind of a template for learning Icelandic adjectives. And I'm going to encourage you again to go watch that video and really put in some effort to learn that chart really well, because if you look at these forms of the word eighth, you'll notice that it has a lot of similarities to the singular forms of hin. So I definitely recommend learning that chart because it'll help you a lot with these numbers. So let's look at some examples here, remembering that the number 1 has to agree with the noun that it's modifying in gender. For example, eitt hundur. Hundur means dog, and it's a masculine word, so we need the masculine form of 1. So eitt hundur, 1 dog. Bók, which means book, is a feminine word, so we use the form ein bók. Or eitt hús, which means 1 house, and that's the neuter form. These are all in nominative, which is what we use for the subject of our sentence. Let's look at some accusative numbers. So ég á einn hund. This is I have 1 dog. Hund is the accusative form of hundur, so we're going to use the accusative form of eitt, which is also eitt. But it looks a little bit different in this sentence. So we have hún með eina bók. She has 1 book. So now bók is in the accusative, and we're going to use the word eina, which is the accusative feminine word for 1. Við eigum eitt hús. We have 1 house. Let's look at some dative examples. Hann bjargaði einum hundi. So hundi in this case is the dative form of hundur, and we always use the dative after the verb bjarga, and we're going to use the dative form of 1. He saved 1 dog, einum. Hún lokaði einni bók og opnaði aðra. She closed 1 book and opened another. So that's einni is the dative feminine form of 1. Tvær fjölskyldur bjuggu í einu húsi means 2 families lived in 1 house. This is the neuter dative form of 1. And I'm only going to show 1 genitive example because the genitive numbers aren't used too much. The main place where you're going to see the genitive numbers is when you're talking about your age, in which case you always need to use the genitive form of the number. So hún eins árs means she is 1 year old. And we're using the word eins and the genitive form of ár for year. So hún eins árs means she is 1 year old. One other kind of fun meaning for the word eight is when it's used as an adjective, it can mean to be alone. So han einn heima means he is home alone. And you can use the word ein for when talking about a feminine subject, or you can use eitt when talking about a neuter subject. All right, let's move on to the word to. Now, check out these forms, and again, they do kind of bear some similarities to other adjectives, and this is again when the hin chart might come in handy. So here's our nominative forms, tveir, tvær, and tvö. The accusative forms are två, tvær, and tvö. The dative forms are tveimur or tveim, and that's the same form for masculine, feminine, and neuter. Now, if you're confused why there are two forms, I've asked a lot of Icelanders about this, and they say it just depends on your preference. I asked if one was more common than the other, and they said not necessarily so. So you just have to decide whether you want to use the word tveim or the word tveimur, and either one works. And if any Icelanders are watching this and have a different take on the situation, then definitely let me know in the comments. I'd be interested to hear if anyone disagrees with that. And the genitive form is tvekja. So let's look at some examples real quick. Það sitja tveir hundar og tvær kisur á gólfinu. So here we have the word tveir and tvær for a masculine word and a feminine word. 2 dogs and 2 cats are sitting on the floor, and these are the nominative forms. So this is just an example so that you can see. Ég á tvo syni og tvær dætur. So now we're talking about the accusative form. This means I have 2 sons and 2 daughters. So you can see the accusative form of tveir in action. And hann hlaup heim á tveimur mínútum means he ran home in 2 minutes. This is the dative form of tveir. And then a real quick genitive form we're going to use with age. Hann tveggja ára gamall means he is 2 years old. All right, let's talk about 3. Our forms in the nominative are þrír, þrjár, and þrjú. In accusative we have þrjá, þrjár, and þrjú. In dative we have þrem or þremur. And in genitive we have þriggja. And I'm not going to show you any examples of those because it's very similar to our examples for tveir. Let's look at the forms for 4. The nominative forms we have fjórir, fjórar, and fjögur. In accusative we have fjóra, fjórar, and fjögur. Dative we have fjórum all the way across. And genitive we have fjögurra. This is also commonly pronounced fjægra in daily speech. So we're only going to look at one example for the word for, and it's going to have to do with that genitive form. Hann 24 ára, which means he is 24 years old. Notice here, we're talking about a number greater than 4. We're talking about 24. In Icelandic, whenever we use a word that, or a number that ends with 1, 2, 3, or 4, we're going to have to use these forms that we've been looking at here. So here, we're going to use one of the inflected forms of 4 because we're talking about 24. The only exception to that is for the numbers 11, 12, 13, and 14, which we'll talk about in the next video. There you don't need to worry about using the word for because there's a separate word for 14. But if you're ever using 24 or 34 or 104, you're going to have to use one of the different forms like we've been seeing in this video. All right, so that's the lesson on agreement for the numbers 1 through 4. Let's move on to the next rule. This is for freestanding numbers. This is when you're not counting a specific object. You're just saying the number that something has been assigned or has been given. And it's easiest just to show you some examples. This is not a complete list. But for example, you'll use masculine numbers when you are counting. So if you ask, a 3-year-old, can you count to 10? They're going to count using the masculine numbers. They're going to start with 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, and so forth. You're also going to use the masculine numbers when you are giving a telephone number. That'll generally be in the nominative when you're giving the actual number, but when you're calling the number and using the verb hringja, you're going to use the accusative. For example, hringdu í 112 means call 112, which is the emergency number in Iceland. All right, let's talk about when you're going to use neuter numbers freestanding. First, when you're telling the time, and second, for addresses. For example, klukkan 1 means it's 1 o'clock. We're going to use the neuter number to talk about what hour it is. Hún býr á Kleppsvegi 4 means she lives at Kleppsvegur 4. And we're not going to decline the word fjögur. It's just going to be freestanding, and it's going to be in the neuter gender. So So this right here marks the end of what I'm going to call the beginner half of the video, the more important basic rules. The next rules are going to be a little bit more nuanced and be a little bit more advanced. So stick with me if you're up for that. So let's talk about the weak declension of the number 1. If you remember from one of my other videos where I talk about the difference between weak and strong adjectives, the word 1 or eighth can often be used as an adjective as opposed to just a number to count things. And when you use it that way, when you use the weak declension of the adjective, it means the only. And so let's look at the weak declension real quick of 1. It's much simpler, I guess, than the strong declension that we've already looked at. You can see that most of the forms look the same based on gender, except for the nominative forms are different than the other ones. And let's look at just a couple examples so you can see what I mean. Hún býr í því eina húsi í götunni. This means she lives in the only house on the street. So we're using the weak declension of 1 because we have a definite noun here, the house. And when we use 1 in this way, it means the only house. Here's another example. Ég talaði við þann eina sem mætti, which means I spoke with the only one, meaning the only person who came. Það eina sem ég veit að hún frá Frakklandi. This means the only thing I know is that she's from France. So watch out for that when we have a weak declension of the word eighth. It's being used as an adjective, and it means the only one, or the only something. Let's move on to the next rule. This is the plural 1. Now, this might sound really strange to you. Why on earth would there be a plural form of the number 1? Isn't 1 always singular? And this is a bit unique, a unique thing about Icelandic. Well, maybe it's not unique. You can let me know if you speak another language that does something similar. But we're going to use the plural form of 1 for nouns that have no singular form. At least that's the simplest way to explain it. I'll explain a little bit more in a second. Let's look at the forms real quick. So in nominative, we have einir, einar, and ein. Accusative, we have eina, einar, and ein. Dative, we have einum. And genitive, we have eitna. Now, these forms should look really familiar if you've learned the Hin chart because the endings are almost the exact same. So let's look at some examples when we're going to use them. Ég á aðeins einar buxur. This means I have only one pair of pants. So buxur means pants, and it is a word that is always in the plural form. There is no singular option. And so when we use the plural form of 1, we're saying one pants, or in this case, in English, we say one pair of pants. Here's another example. Hann keypti ein blá jakkaföt og ein svört. This means he bought one blue suit and one black suit. So the word jakkaföt is a neuter word that is always plural, no matter what. And so in order to say that we have one suit, we need to use the plural form of the word eighth. This next example is a little bit different and adds a little bit of complication to the rule. Ég á eina sokka means I have one pair of socks. Now in this case, the word sokkur means sock, a single sock, and there actually is a singular form, and then the plural form is sokkar. And so in this case, there actually is a singular form too, but we can use the plural form of 1 to mean one pair of. So ég á eina sokka means I have one pair of socks. Now, let's talk about the plural forms of 2, 3, and 4. Now, again, this probably sounds confusing because aren't 2, 3, and 4 always plural? I think the right name for this in English is we call it the collective plural, but if someone knows the better name, then definitely let me know in the comments. But we're going to use the collective plural of 2, 3, and 4 for nouns that have no singular form, just like we saw with the plural form of the number 1. So let's look at the forms real quick, and they're kind of complicated. They look a lot like other adjectives though. So for 2, the plural form of 2 looks like this. In nominative we have tvennir, tvennar, and tvenn. In accusative we have tvenna, tvennar, and tvenn. In dative we have tvennum, and in genitive we have tvennra. The forms for the plural of 3 is þrennir, þrennar, and þrenn, þrenna, þrennar, and þrenn, þrennum, and þrennra. And then for the number 4, we have fernir, fernar, and fern. We have ferna, fernar, and fern. In dative, we have fernum, and in genitive, we have ferdra. So, let's look at some examples. Við erum búin að fara í þrenna tónleika í sumar. We've gone to 3 concerts this summer. Now, the word tónleikar is a masculine word meaning concert that is always plural. So in order to say 3 concerts, we need to use the collective plural form of 3. Hún á ferna skó. She has 4 pairs of shoes. Now, skór, meaning shoe, is another word that actually does exist in the singular and in the plural, and we use these collective plurals to talk about pairs. I know that this was a lot to go over, so don't stress out about it. Take it one step at a time, especially focus on the first half of the video if you haven't learned those numbers yet. And I promise that the next video on numbers, all the rest of the numbers in Icelandic will be very easy compared to what we've seen in this video. Hang in there and good luck. Bless, bless.